All right, I'll kick it off. Hello and welcome. Welcome back to, I think, episode 3. My 2-year-old's teaching me how to count, so I'm up to 3 now.
I don't know. If we were having an official count, that's probably it. But
I mean, the first one was like a beta test. The second one is our sophomore slump. So now we're ready. We're back months later in fighting fit shape to talk about the top of the top, the pinnacle, the top of the mountain, the flagship.
I know.
TOTL.
I feel so privileged just to be able to have the conversation. Honestly, I never thought personally that I would have ever heard so many flagship headphones. Like never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined that. So,
yeah.
Plug for starting a YouTube channel where you review things, because you may make some connections and people send you some awesome stuff that you can try out.
It's funny how that happens. Like, not really the intent, but once you put it out there and you start sharing your voice and sharing your experiences with headphones, it's pretty awesome how the community kind of comes out of the woodwork and says, you know what, you've heard these 3 things, you ought to hear this 4th thing because maybe you'd give an interesting perspective. And I really like that about the folks who are involved with this hobby, that there is a pretty genuine desire to like be open and share. And it's not, in most cases, it's not about like, look at me, I'm braggadocious, I got the best stuff. It's more like, oh, let me tell you, I did try both those things, and here's what I thought, and here's why you might like one over the other.
Well, one thing that I think is really interesting is there's always those people that have super strong opinions, but my general feeling about the community is like most of us just want to kind of hear where other people are at with these things to get a read on like, is what I heard what they heard? Is, because none of us know, right? I mean, when we're listening, like you don't know if what you're hearing is what I'm hearing, and sometimes it seems like it's wildly different. So I think it's interesting that people... I remember, I think it was like, I watched like a Zeos video and he was saying it seems like there's like 2 people that watch these videos. He's like, there's the people that are genuinely trying to make a decision to buy, or it's the people that already own it and they're trying to see if I agree with them or not. Like,
yeah, for sure. And I have that where, I have people who like leave snarky comments because they're mad because they own a thing that like wasn't right for me. And I'm like, hey man, if you like it, like you like it. You don't have to justify it to me. It's like, it's cool. Like we have different ears. We have different brains. It's all good.
Well, and enter the whole reason for companies making flagships and different I mean, they don't all sound the same, right? I know that Steve Guttenberg, like he's talked about this before where it's like, if high-end audio could be objective, then every high-end thing would sound exactly the same.
Yeah, I've thought about that. I think that's like a perfect way to phrase it. Like, in theory, if we all had the same tastes, same like wiring in our brains, same shape of our ear canals, same everything. Did you get a little kicker?
I heard a whale.
Yeah. Then yeah, in theory, we would know what the best thing was, right? We would have a definition of like, this is the perfect thing, but there is no perfect thing because we all want something different. Like we all each consider the best thing to be something different. And I think that's really interesting when you look at flagships. So like, how do you like that word gets thrown around, right? Flagship. Some people like to use like top of the line. Like how do you kind of define that territory of the flagship?
Yeah. I mean, I guess in my mind, it's pretty much like a company's flagship is basically the most expensive thing they make. I mean, maybe the way to put it is like, it's the most expensive consumer thing they make. Because, so for instance, I mean, we could talk about Sennheiser for a moment, and we could talk about how their flagship is probably the 800S, but I mean, of course they have like the HE1, but that's like $50,000 that like not really most people will buy. And then I mean, Hi-Fi Man is kind of the same, right? Because they have the Susvara, which pretty much most people I would say consider their flagship. I don't know, you can disagree if you like, but then they have like the Shangri-La, but that's like not really like general public consumer stuff. I don't know. How do you feel about it?
I think that's a pretty good definition. It's like, what's their sort of fullest expression of their point of view? Like, this is for our company, like this is like our fullest expression where we like hit that law of diminishing, like where that law of diminishing returns, which is always in effect, just plummets, right? So like you said, it's like, sure, Hyphaman does make a headphone that's more expensive than the Susvara, but it's like, well, they make the Shangri-La Junior, right? So that's like 3 times, and then they make the Shangri-La Senior, and that's like 25 times. So
those are more like, I don't know. I might do a lot of car references here because I've been playing a lot of Gran Turismo 7, and I'm just in that mindset right now. But I mean, I'm thinking like those are more experimental things.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they do make a few that are available to the public to sell, but it's not like a mass produced item.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it too. Like a flagship to not be like a hypercar, or like, you know, it's like, you know, Ferrari will come out with something where it's like, oh, we're making 4 of these. They're all pre-sold and they're each like $5.5 million. And like, if you ever want to use it, you have to like bring it to the track, and our track crew will show up and set it up for you. Like that's not a supercar. That's a beyond car. That is an experiment. You know, that's a thing. So I think that's a nice way of like sort of capping it, is like it is the top of the consumer line to a point where it's like still made in decent quantity, right? And there are like small builders. Like this is like, there are folks like, you know, I love the ES Labs, ES1A electrostat. Well, he does some other stuff, but that's kind of like his headphone that he makes, right? Like that's the one that's got the most sort of original parts to him, and then he does some like reconfigs of some stuff. Like, so is that his flagship?
Yeah, I don't know. Would you consider that a flagship? I guess when I'm thinking like flagship, I'm thinking more of like larger production companies that are putting, like you said, something out there to like represent the company of like, this is who we are, this is what we can do.
Yeah, whereas, I think that's how I think of it as well.
I mean, I think of it as like switching metaphors to motorcycles now, okay?
Staying in auto sports, it's fine.
Staying in auto sports. Right, like I was really into one-off, like custom-built cafe racers for a while, right? But those aren't really like flagships. They're awesome and they're super cool, and a lot of them can perform extremely well. But like a flagship would be more like, I don't know. I mean, pick a company again, like a production motorcycle, like a Kawasaki, like the Ninja. I don't even know what they're up to now, like 1400. Something,
sure.
Right? That would be like their flagship, right? As opposed to something that somebody like took apart and rebuilt custom.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And even if like, you know, they did a deal with like Roland Sands or whatever, and he did like 10 bikes for them, that's still, you can't call that their flagship, because that's it's like a side venture. All right. So I think we've got a general working definition, which is like, you've got to be a manufacturer of some scale, and this has to be sort of the top of your offering outside of your just like super wacky, super extreme experimental stuff. And I do think like a lot of companies use this to say, hey, if we weren't being driven by market economics and unit economics to cost optimize a product and make a profit on it, which all companies are, since it's a fact, what would we do? Like, what would we do if somebody sort of like took the cuffs off and said like, you know what, you don't need to worry that like most people are willing, you know, to spend 200 or less, and then you've got a smaller group that'll spend 500 or less, and then you've got a smaller group that'll spend 1,000 or less, and then you've got an even smaller group that'll, like, this is just the one where they're like, cool, like what would you make within reason? Like, again,
within reason.
Reason.
I think that's a good way to think about it, right? Is it's like they're like, what, this is the headphone that I really want to build.
Yeah.
You know, like yes, maybe we could do this or we could do this, but that would be so far out of bounds that it just doesn't make sense. But like, this is, as far as like an everyday use thing, like this is what I want and this is what we can do. And then they kind of figure out what seems to happen, right, is they do that. And then they kind of figure out, how can we do it a little bit cheaper?
Yeah.
And then, you know, like Hi-Fi Men, right? The Susvara, I think, is a great example of this. That's where they put their stealth magnets first. I guess I didn't fact check that, but that seems to be the general consensus of the history of stealth magnets. And now all of their headphones have stealth magnets. Like, so they develop the technology with the flagship, and then they slowly figure out how can they bring it into lesser headphones.
Yeah. And what a lot of, like, when you think about why it costs money to make a thing, there's a couple things driving it, right? One is research and development. And typically research and development, is a fixed sunk cost, right? And so the more broadly you can spread the benefits of research and development cost across more units, the economics make more sense. The other thing, of course, is materials. And often when you're pushing into new territory, you're using materials that are less common, or at least the manufacturing process thereof is less well established. So there's more experimentation, there's more scrap rate. Maybe the material itself is more expensive to source. But once you've been making things for a couple of years and you kind of got it figured out, well, that cost comes like right down. It's just, unit economics of mass manufacturing, right? So what else is like driving the cost of these? Not a whole lot else. It's like, did we come up with a novel technology that does something cool? And were we able to make or source the parts we needed to produce it within the price range? So it makes a lot of sense, right, that you see these kind of groundbreaking audio technologies appear in a thing that costs many thousands of dollars, and then within a handful of years, and I actually feel like it doesn't move that fast in audio.
Not crazy fast. No, it doesn't seem like. I mean, at least not up to this point, but it seems like just the world we live in, right, is things are moving faster and faster and faster, and it does seem like headphones are starting to get into that new iteration every year type of thing.
Yeah. They're playing like the tweaking game though now, right? It's like so let's real quick, like let's drop some of the top contenders for flagships. Like what specific headphones do you, when somebody says flagships, go, like what do you name?
Okay, so I mean just the ones that I have experience with over the last month or 2 months, right, is Focal Utopia, Hi-Fi Men Susvara, Final D8000 Pro, LCD5, the Diana TC, and the SR1A. Although, I don't know, that one could be debatable, I'd say. But it's in the same price category anyway. That gets me started. I'll have to think a little bit more. I might be missing one or two here. What about you?
I think that's a good list. There are a couple things in there that already sort of break our rules, though, right? Like like you said, the SR1A. I might have to think about that for a minute, right? Because that is not.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd consider that flagship. It was just in the price range, when I was testing.
But it's like I do sort of think about. I mean, Abyss is actually kind of bends and breaks the rules as well a little bit because their production volumes are not huge, and they don't really have like an affordable line.
That's
right?
true.
They pretty much just have what we would probably classify as flagship. So maybe price range is a bigger factor. Like because like the HD800S, right? It's like people. That is sort of like the flagship.
Oh yeah, we could. I lump that one in there. I mean, I consider that to be a flagship. I don't know.
So that's what is that right now? Like $1,600, $1,400? I'm trying to remember.
It's probably somewhere around there. I mean, used 1,000.
Sure.
Right. That's those are the prices that live in my head. But
and then like, what's the next cheapest headphone on that list that you just dropped? Like, they all get into above 2,000, right?
Well, LCD 5.
That's like $5,000 or $4,500 or something.
I don't know.
Right?
Used, they're $3,500. Like I feel like their price is used dropped crazy. I
think yeah. It's like people were so like the LCD fans were so excited for a new thing, and they all lined up down the block to get them, and then a bunch came into people's hands, and they're like, this is like pretty different from what I thought it was going to be, and then there was an off shedding.
I mean, Utopia is certainly. Used is down into the affordable range, like really. I mean, down into I kind of hate myself for feeling like $2,000 for a headphone is reasonable at this point, but that's where I'm at, right? And you could, if you really shop, you could probably get a Utopia for $2,000.
Yeah, Utopia definitely. I think Utopia fits the flagship model as we described it perfectly, right? Mm-hmm. It's what new, it's in that $3,500 price. I don't actually know what its MSRP is, but it's like. Focal has a full line down to like its projects with mass drop, at like $400 or $500. So it's like that, and that headphone to me is like the focaliest focal. Like it if you've heard like lower end focals and then you hear that lower end focals and then you hear the Utopia, you're like, yep, this seems like where they were going the whole time.
It's not wildly different. It's just mildly better in all aspects, really. I mean, it's just
It's a sharpening of the pencil, as they say, right? It's like
yeah,
it just got a little sharper.
and maybe that leads into like I feel like that's a good point to transition is to like the value of these things. So I think Focal, again, just to talk about Focal, is like the perfect example of like if you can buy an Alex for $400, do you spend $2,000 on a Utopia? I don't know. Like, I mean, we've both talked about how with the Alex, there's something that it doesn't quite jive with us about it, but it's hard to deny its prowess for its price to the point where, man, can you justify $1,500, $2,000 more dollars for a Utopia?
I don't know. It's tough. And then for me, like, I mean, maybe the question is like, do you like the cheaper thing? Like, if you like the cheaper thing in somebody's line, will you like the more expensive thing more? I don't think that's always going to be true, but
Not
I think
100% of the time, but I think a lot of the time.
Like if you like
that
HD
was maybe
600 or 6,
I don't know. I mean, I guess it really depends. Because some of those, right, if you like an LCD 2, that does not mean you're going to like the LCD 5.
it does not. Yeah, some things, but it does probably mean you'd like the LCD 4, which was the previous flagship. That was more like they had more of a lineage. Like it wasn't consistent. It wasn't like LCD 2 is 2 times as good as a 1, and then 3 is 3 times as good as a 1, and 4 is 4 times. They actually kind of had some different flavors. Like the 3, the 2 and the 3 have very different signatures, and then the 4 is sort of like the best of all of them married together. So I kind of think, maybe that's not a good rule of thumb, right? I mean, with Sennheiser, right, like the 600 or the 660, I think if you like that, you're probably going to love the 800S. I think there's a lot there that's like from the same DNA.
Yeah, I mean, but at the same time, I didn't really like the 6XX or 650, but I did think the 800S was a very capable headphone. Like, I guess I didn't ultimately buy one, but I definitely appreciated what it did, for sure.
I'm in the same camp, but I think I've never really fallen in love with anything from Sennheiser.
Me neither.
Begin the hate mail now. Sorry.
Well,
again,
people know, if people have watched my channel, they know where I stand with this stuff. So, but like with Hi-Fi Man though, with Focal and Hi-Fi Man, I feel like, right, if you like the Alex, I can't imagine you not liking the Utopia. And with Hi-Fi Man, if you like, Aria, if you like HE1000, if you like HE6, again, I find it hard to imagine that you wouldn't like the Susvara a bunch.
It's funny though, like, I've on a couple of Susvara threads, and there are definitely people who are like HK1000 people or HE1000 people who move up to the Susvara at some point, and they don't like it. Some of them love it eventually, but not at first, because it's pretty different in timbre, I think. But like the HE1000 is like, it's a little bit more playful. It's a little more, it's easier to kind of quickly be like, oh, this is a really satisfying headphone, and it's a detail monster. It's a fantastic headphone. It's almost like Headphone almost sort of has 2 flagships, because at the price point, what's the brand new HE1000 SE or V2? They're like
I think they're around 3,000, but like I don't know, you can't see it, but I mean, well, you can see it signed, but the people that are listening can't see it. But that's what I'm wearing right now is HE1000. This is where I've landed.
Yeah, interesting, right?
After listening to all these high end things, like I landed on the HE1000 because I do feel like it's at least really close to a flagship level, if it's not, what I mean? And I got mine for $1,500, so it's like,
I mean, that's in my experience, pretty great dollar per value in, very high end headphones. Like I think that's a pretty good sweet spot right there. Like you're not leaving much on the table, if anything.
I agree. Yeah. If you get into the 1,000, 1,500 mark, you're not gaining a ton, I wouldn't say, by paying another $4,000 or $3,000 or whatever. But that doesn't mean that I don't think those headphones are better. Like this, I love the Susvara, right? And you're a Susvara man, right?
Oh,
You
yeah.
own the Susvara.
Yep.
So, I mean, obviously you think it's worth the money.
I mean, not every day, but certainly some days I go, hot damn. But yeah. I mean, I got mine used, so at least shaved a little bit off of the painful price that's attached to that headphone. But the challenge with that headphone is that it is unfortunately incredibly amp dependent.
Yeah.
And I think amps have impact on all headphones across the
Sure.
board. But I think, and maybe this is just something you tell yourself when you're in this deep, but it's like at that level, you really want to hear that headphone. If you've got that kind of money in it, it's like you want to hear its quote unquote true capabilities. Not all flagships require something like the 1266 definitely require some pretty specific amp matching in my experience.
The final D8000 Pro. That thing, you put that thing on anything and it sounded awesome. I feel like that's a headphone that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, that I was like, this is a really good headphone and I can run it off of like an iPhone dongle.
Yeah.
And it sounds amazing.
Yep.
Yeah. So
that thing's super easy to drive. The Utopia is actually pretty easy to drive, although diehard Utopia people will tell you that you really want sort of a nice tube setup to kind of soften it a bit and just take a little bit of the edge off, maybe bring a little bit more fluidity back into the sound. So take it or leave it. If you like it how it sounds out of the box, right on.
Well, and this kind of goes back to our last episode that was about building a system, right? Like depending on it, like if you're going top tier, the headphone, I mean, I feel like you got to set your sights on the headphone first. So if you want a flagship headphone, right, you got to kind of know, okay, I want to buy this, but then I'm going to need what to drive it. And maybe, I guess it just depends on how you want to go about it, right? Because the way I've gone at this point is I'm pretty much like around $1,000 for each piece. So headphones, $1,500, my amp is $1,000, and my DAC is $1,000. Right? But you could go D8000 Pro with, a Mojo.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know. You could go about it so many different ways.
It again comes down to like, what are you trying to get out of it? What do you like sound signature wise? But just to focus us back on flagships for a minute, right? So I don't think there's a huge amount of people listening to this podcast yet, but I imagine that some that are like, you guys are crazy. I'm never spending multiple thousands of dollars on my whole system, much less on a single pair of headphones. Like, who cares about flagships? They're just for like people who have lost their mind in this hobby or who have too much disposable income. And I think that's fair. But I also
Totally
think that
fair.
they do serve a purpose, right? Because they are like that flagship. Like they are that chance for the manufacturer to get new ideas into production, to get new processes and materials, to get that R&D out of the lab and into the field, and to get not only some revenue coming in to kind of offset those upfront costs of producing a new thing, but also to get feedback and to get like, I'm sure Odyssey has learned a ton from what came back from the LCD5, right?
Yeah.
Now they're very established that, they're making things in huge volumes. I'm not too worried about them, but you think about Abyss and how they've like responded to some of the feedback they get on their various headphones and how they're like pushing them in different directions to sort of satisfy different parts of the market. If they're not out there being made, even if they're not accessible to everyone, which I totally get, and I think it is kind of a ludicrous way to spend money, but you do what you do. Like, what's the point then? And I would tell somebody like, I think it's great to hear these things, even if you don't want, like, even if you could afford it and don't want to own it or can't afford it or whatever. Like, it's been so educational to my brain to like hear these sort of singular voices from a company of like, this is what we're trying to get to. Like, it's like going to shows, going to like, now that the like headphone shows are coming back, Can Jam and stuff. It's like, I think even if you're not somebody who's going to spend this kind of money on this hobby, but you're pretty interested in the hobby, it's cool to try to seek out opportunities to hear these things because they will tweak your brain.
Yeah. You know, one thing that I'm thinking about as you're talking about that is you kind of think like the narrative is, right, you'll hear something like a Susvara and you'll have to have it, you know, or you'll hear something like that's top of the line and like you're worried that, well, now you've got to have that thing. I almost feel like it's been the opposite for me in that like it's satisfied me in that I've heard it, but now I'm kind of living with just within my price range and I'm going, oh, I'm pretty close to that and I'm pretty content. Like I know what that much more would get me, but I'm like, I know what those can do, but what I have sounds really good.
I think that's great. I've had a lot of that experience too, where it's like I've heard things and I'm like, oh, I don't need this. Like, this was fun to hear. Like, the 1266 has, for me, some of the most amazing bass performance of any headphone I've ever heard. It haunts me. It's so interesting. But after spending time with that headphone, I'm like, I don't think I would want to listen to this headphone that much if I had it. And cool, so I can like check that off the list, put that aside. And as I've gone through other flagships, there's been sort of something about them that's I'm like, you know what, maybe not for me, but I'm glad I've heard it. And I think that's what's kind of nice is not only is there what you were explaining, which is the like, oh, I've heard that thing that cost twice as much. For my brain, it's not worth twice as much. So cool, I can be very content here in my space.
Yeah.
And then there's this thing of just like, you're not going to fall in, like, you probably won't love all these things. I mean, no. They're not for everyone.
Well, and I think that's a good point too, is it tells you, you know, that money doesn't necessarily buy, you know, the happiness, right? Like, you have to know what you want or what you like, and then you can spend money and it'll buy you some happiness. But like, but if you just blindly hop on a forum, you know, you're new to the hobby and you're like, I want to drop $5,000 and get the best.
Yeah.
The odds of you ending up with something that you like really love is probably pretty small, honestly.
I feel so worried when I see those kind of posts of somebody being like, okay, like they had like $100 headphone and they're like, you know what, I see all you guys. I just want to skip the whole madness and go straight to the end and just plunk down my money now and have a great headphone and skip the upgrade process. And I'm like, oh, I totally hear where you're coming from. But the likelihood that you're just going to get it right, that you're just going to get the one that you're like, yep, this is it. And maybe if you haven't heard a ton of stuff, you'll just get that and you'll be like, holy smokes, this thing is like melting my brain.
Well,
it's
that's
so amazing.
true.
And
yeah,
just stop. Yeah.
But I don't know. I just, I feel like for me, it's helped me get off the hedonic treadmill of things. And honestly, I've been trying more cheap stuff now. I'm like, okay, I hear what the best can do. Like, now let me just try a little bit, like, spread it around and try a little more variety. And like,
Well,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so I think, yes, well, we're like, you know what, flagships, you don't need them. Also, probably like, so what do you think? Like, what were your favorites of the things you heard, if you had to kind of punch list it?
hands down.
Susvara.
Like, it wasn't even close. Like, I kind of did a little like grading system where I ranked. I think I had 7 of them on hand, and I threw in the HE1000s were in that, and my HE6 were in that too, because I was just throwing them in on like, in these different categories, how would I rank these for just my super subjective, right, like preferences, just to see where they'd end up if I did like some sort of like an objective point system type of a thing in it, and I just had something to reference. And the 2 that came out on top for me were the Susvara and the LCD5. Susvara, just because I just enjoyed it so much, really, and I think it's comfortable, and it matches my preferences really well. And the LCD5, just because I was really impressed with the performance of it. Yeah. But if somebody was going to like put those 2 headphones in front of me and be like, you get one, like, I would reach for the Susvara without like, it wouldn't be a debate at all.
Yeah.
For me.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I'm in a very similar camp, except I probably don't. The LCD5 didn't come up that high for me. Just, I don't know. It wasn't. The sound signature of it. It wasn't that it wasn't a detail monster, and like you said, it's the performance of it's incredible, but just the timbre of it and the presentation for me was like, I don't know, it grated me. And of course the the phasers sort of like poking out. It's never my favorite thing.
I kind of likened it, and again, to go back to our auto sports metaphors here, analogies, like I kind of liken the LCD5 to like a race car, right? Like you're going to feel everything on the road, every bump, every rattle, every little thing you're going to feel. And like, it's honestly not super fun to drive that way all the time.
Right. I think that's a good way to put it, right? It's like if you're trying to get a flagship because you want to have one headphone to rule them all, and that's what you go to morning, noon, and night, that's maybe put you in a different camp versus if you're like, you know what, I want something that's going to give me just a very unique listening experience that like I'm only going to pop these things on late at night by myself and just like zone out. And like then, maybe something like the 1266 or something is cooler because it's just more different, right? It just sound like you put it on, you're like, whoa, that's like very different from other things I've heard. And I guess the LCD5 had a little bit of that where I was like, oh, this is different. It's got some intensity to it.
Well, and I think too, if you're thinking the way I think, I'm going, if I'm spending this much money on a headphone, that's the one that I want to use a lot of the time, right? So comfort is a huge factor. And honestly, I didn't think a lot of those headphones were very comfortable. I didn't think the LCD5 was particularly comfortable. I didn't think the Diana was comfortable, right? The SR1A I thought was just, it's not uncomfortable, but it's weird.
I feel like the MySphere and the SR1A and some of these things that are just kind of outliers. Like I have a little trouble putting them in the flagship group as we've defined it. But I think they're interesting. We almost need to have another conversation about that, like the oddballs, the boundary pushers, the things that are in production but in a not a huge quantity, and
pretty
sort
limited
of
capacity.
Trying to push a new tech or a new point of view.
My point was just that comfort is a huge part of my listening experience. And like, while I can tolerate something for short periods, if I'm just trying to like hear it and figure out, where it sits, if it's not comfortable, it's just, I'm not going to keep it. It's pretty much what it comes down to,
Yep. I guess the other sort of flagship elephant in the room we haven't really touched on is STAX.
Yeah.
Right,
I don't have, so I was going to ask you about that because I know that you just put out, well, I know you've talked about that one kind of, I don't know, what would you call that? ES Labs, is that correct?
Yeah, ES Labs. It's the ES1A. That's like a boutique headphone. I'd put that, I'm going to put that in the category of like, boutique, custom builder, oddballs, and we could definitely do a conversation about that because there's some great stuff in the world of like non-mass manufactured headphones that I think.
But you have my point being that you have some good ESTAT experience, and I don't. So, and I know you've just had like the STAX 009S. I think you just put out like a quick take or something on that. So, like, where do you think that sits compared to these other ones that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think that the ESTAT, like the top of the line STAX, are very often, put in the conversation of like flagships or, TOTL headphones, right? And it's often the 007 and the 009, not necessarily the square ones, the Lambdas, the L300, 500, 700. Although those are like not inexpensive and super awesome in their own right, but I think when the conversation of quote unquote flagship comes up, you don't see those as much. You typically see the Omega style, the big round STAX. And to that, there's also the Hyphaman Jr. and the Dan Clark Audio Voce, which are also sort of similarly priced, big, expensive ESTATs. It's interesting a lot, I guess. I was trying to think. When we think about flagships, there are a lot of big planars in the flagship category, but there are some dynamics like the Focal Utopia, for instance.
Would you consider, what about like a Verite? Would you consider that flagship?
I would, yeah. I would. Not, I mean, again, it's like It's a little bit more of a boutique manufacturer. The volumes aren't as huge, but I think if you look
There's
at the
enough of them out there. I mean, I feel like for ZMF, it's
yeah, it's the top of their line. It's in
or
the same price
Atrium
point.
now, right?
Yeah, or Atrium now, or Verite not closed, Verite open. But yeah, I mean their line starts at what $1,100, which is not cheap, and moves up to $2,600 or more with special editions and blah blah blah. But that's not really about sound. That's just about cool, fun collectory stuff. But yeah, I mean I think the VC. I haven't heard the Verite open, and I haven't heard the new Atrium, but I think the Verite close from sort of a detail retrieval standpoint, the overall sound signature and the experience of listening to that headphone, that to me is in line with some of the other flagships I've heard. I think it competes price wise with things in that same insane $2,500.
Yeah, I
region.
mean, well, just from what I heard, I've assumed that it fits right in there. I would think. But back to your e-stats. So 009 STAX, amongst all these other ones we've talked about, is it at the top of your list, bottom of your list?
I think that the super high-end STAX stuff is really, really interesting because, the whole thing about e-stats is that the piece of material that they're moving is crazy, crazy light, like much lighter than planar. And so they're the fastest thing you'll ever hear. Like just the velocity and the accelerator, like things can just kind of come out of nowhere in a way that like I don't think any planar I've heard or dynamic can match. That being said, for me, they will always have a slightly differentiated timbre that is a little bit unnatural. And I was talking to somebody and they pointed out this idea that like most people, when they've heard music reproduced by electronics, have primarily heard dynamic drivers their entire life since they were a baby. Some of us have now heard a decent amount of planars, right? But very few people have listened to very much, whether it's speakers or headphones that are electrostats. And so it may not be fair to say that like it is a less natural sound. It is just
different.
not the sound we're used to.
Yeah.
I don't know if I totally buy that argument.
When we gauge if something sounds natural or real, right? Well, if all we've heard is music produced from a dynamic driver speaker, then it's not going to sound...
It definitely sounds very different. And there are parts of it that you could argue are more real because they don't deal with some of the physics that other technologies deal with. But I don't know. I say that to just put a grain of salt to like the, are e-stats inherently sort of a little bit wrong sounding or not? Also, like, it's like anything. You listen to them for like 2 weeks and you don't listen to any other things, and it'll totally rewire your brain. And then you go back to like a dynamic or a planar and your brain goes like, this is something missing. Something's not quite right. So, but where I sort of ended up, all that aside, is that I probably fall into the camp of planars. Like when you're at the flagship level, like I think that's the technology to me that strikes the best balance between being really interesting, having incredible detail, but also not getting into sort of weird, wacky territory that just sounds too disconnected from what my brain considers real.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so a few people pointed that out with my list as I was going through it, and the one thing that I really wish I would have had the Utopia on hand when I had the other ones on hand, which I had the Utopia about like a month before I had all those other ones. So I just know that I loved the Utopia, right? But I don't know how it would stack up next to these other things. And that would tell me, right, like probably the dynamic aspect of it is, do I really like planars, or did I just not have a high-end dynamic to compare to, to go with that? So I don't know. That's probably, honestly, it's funny to say that like the Utopia is one of the headphones that's like on my bucket list because I've already heard it. Mm-hmm. But now I want to hear it with the perspective of and the experience of hearing these other top tier things. Yeah,
for sure. I get that. And I think, again, it's like one of these things where if people told me they heard a Susvara with this or that amp, am like, did you hear Susvara? And I think there's a little bit of that too with the Utopia. It's like, did you hear it was like some two-way threes or like a nice tube setup? Like, then did you really hear it? It's very unfair, right? In some ways, to be like, you're making a freaking like $3,000 headphone, and then it needs all this like hoo-ha in front of it before I'm hearing it for real, before I'm hearing the best of it. Are you kidding me? Like, but
that probably right there tells you or gives you some direction, right? In flagships, like if that sounds ridiculous to you, then maybe you go one direction with your flagship. But like, I think of like the Susvara. If you get a Susvara, you're probably a person that wants to play with some amps and some DACs to see if you can find, the perfect match. So you're maybe that person. Whereas if you just want to get it and enjoy it, you might be a D8000 Pro type of person. Like I think there's a little bit of some of these headphones that have these reputations, like you go into them. I feel like if you're going to buy a flagship, you're probably pretty well researched, right? And you go into them with the idea that you might find that enjoyable to play around with different amps and do a little bit of switching and, hunting.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly all a little bit in this hobby because we like that tweaking aspect, and we like to sort of solve the puzzle and find the synergy and build the chain that like aligns to how our brain works. I think there's also something funny about this as far because it is so legendarily hard to drive, like the HE6, right? Where it's almost like it almost just adds to its mystique, that it's like, it's like you buy an expensive car and then the first thing somebody asks you, like, oh, well, did you do this or that mod to it? And I got to do what now? it's like, well, you don't really have it then yet, now do you? So I think there's something to that at that flagship unobtainium tier that people kind of like, that it's just such a monster to drive, and so they can debate ad nauseum. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of forum pages to this topic floating around the world.
Well, and it feels like, I mean, and when it comes down to it, right, that's why you just gotta, at least for me, that's why I just got to do some of this stuff for myself, just to decide, is it real? Is it something like, a lot of me anymore, like I try to look at things skeptically through like a consumerism lens of like, well, of course people are going to tell you, of course manufacturers are going to tell you like it needs to be driven with this or that or whatever because they want you to keep buying stuff. Like, I mean, if you get one headphone and you're happy, then doesn't, I mean, then there's no more money to be made off you, right? So I don't know. That's in my head. I'm always kind of like thinking about that too.
Yeah. Stay frosty. Well, how do we wrap it up?
I think we're at a pretty good point here, right? I mean, seems like a natural lull. I don't know that I feel like we come to the end of these and I don't feel like we ever really have any conclusions to offer. It's just like, these are some of the things that are happening and maybe we're onto something here, but maybe not.
That's shop talk. It's just a therapy session. We're just here to air our dirty laundry. I was joking earlier that we would probably call this like Flagships Part 1 because I can't believe it's a topic that we could cover in 40 minutes and be done. I suspect we'll talk again about flagships in the future from another lens, and I'd love to hear if anyone actually made it this long through the episode. Like, what are your reactions to flagships? Like, do you think it's all just silly hoo-ha? Like, why is anyone spending this much money? Why, like, our hobby has lost its mind? Like, I think there are people out there with the point of view, and I think it is justifiable that, like, like, how many crazy headphones were there above, like, $1,500, whatever, 5 years ago? Like, there have been an onslaught of, like, Audeze not only came out with the LCD5, they also came out with their first E-Stat at also $4,500. You've got Abyss has gotten bigger. You've got, I mean, we never even talk about people like Grotto, whatever. Like, they've got multi-$1,000 headphones in their flagship category. It's like a bit of an onslaught right now of these super spendy headphones.
And I think they saw it coming, right? They saw the market was there for it. Because, I mean, if you think about high-end 2-channel people, I mean, geez, like, you're talking some dough there. Yeah. And so part of, in my head, I'm going, well, I can justify a $2,000 headphone because Like speakers would be like $10,000. Like, you know?
Sure. Go on like the Audiogon forums. It's hilarious. There'll be like threads that are like, looking for new affordable preamp, like tube hybrid preamp, budget no more than $15,000. It's just like that world gets bonkers. Like $100,000 speakers are not unheard of by any means. Whereas like we know there's some $50,000 headphones, but that is not considered like anywhere near the norm, at least in this hobby right now.
Well, and I think honestly, and maybe that's why I'm enjoying headphones and like have kind of went down the headphone, is because I saw the top and I was like, it's possible.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's obtainable. Like even I know $4,000 or $5,000 for a headphone is crazy, but like most people could probably make that happen, at least for a little bit of time, and then they could sell it and they could have the experience, right? Yeah. Whereas like a $50,000 thing is not like, how many people in the world are going to ever be able to drop that? And who would you sell it to if you bought it?
Right. And then you got to ship this giant thing. So yeah, headphones definitely let you kind of play this game with slightly less risk, which is great. And we've talked a lot about buying and selling stuff. And I think flagships are one of those ones. It's trickier, right? Because you've got a liquidity issue, right? You've got a lot more money on the table if you're holding, even if it's used, let's say a $2,200 pair of headphones used.
Yeah.
And
There's
even
still
if you
not
bought
that many
them,
people in the world that are going to spend that kind of money.
Yeah. Even if you bought them to try them and you think you're going to sell them, you're still going to have some carrying costs with that. Like just the PayPal fees and the
we talked about that in our buy sell. If you haven't listened yet, go listen to our buy and sell conversations where we discuss this much more in depth.
Ad nauseum. I was also thinking I do have an episode I did on not the 009S, but the 009 versus the Susvara.
I remember watching that. Yeah.
If folks are just interested in that, like, kind of what's like, ESTAT doing kind of the best it can do versus Planar doing kind of the best it can do. We could debate if those are really the best, and obviously STAX now has more things on top of the 009, but it's still a freaking great headphone.
And we'll throw links in the description wherever you're listening to this at, like with some of these things that we've talked about too. So.
Yeah, because I think between us we've got one or two reviews on most of these big boy headphones we've talked about, and I think you'll see that like the conversation sort of echoes this. I don't know that either you or I was just like pure 100% fanboy of everything we tried at this price point. I think there's a lot of nits to pick when it comes to this, and honestly, I feel more empowered leaning in and being critical on these super expensive headphones, because it's like, well, you better come correct, son.
Yeah, I agree. You do feel like you're nitpicking, but it's like, you're paying several grand for a headphone. Like,
I paid the bitch about this headphone.
Yeah. All right, I think that's the end right there.
That's it.
You have the right to complain about headphones if you spend several $1,000s on them.
Agreed. That's our takeaway. Nailed it. All right.
All right. Next time, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.